Yesterday, I turned 1 year of full confinement, so the world is madness, and I can't wait to hear all of your experiences as well. But in the midst of all of these individual situations, we also have a lot of global challenges, and today we will be talking about three of the most pressing issues of our times. And this conversation is being brought to you by the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development. And I'm accompanied actually here as well by my colleague Rosa Lizarde from the Feminist Task Force, who are also co-convening the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development here. And we are also one of the organizers of the Campaign of Campaigns, which is an initiative we have with the civil society group on financing for development. Rosa, you want to say hi?
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're thrilled to be able to bring this agenda to the NGO CSW Forum. It's an important dialogue that we as feminists, as gender advocates, really need to incorporate into all of our agendas. So we're thrilled to bring you this dialogue on feminist macro solutions on debt, trade, tax through a Campaign of Campaigns. And we're so appreciative of our speakers today, who are a dynamo team. All of them, each one of them in their own right is such a great speaker, but together it's really quite a team that we have. So please look for the synergies and connect to your agendas. We're thrilled to be able to present this on the NGO-CSW Forum. Thank you so much. Thank you, Emilia.
Thank you so much, Rosa. And I just wanted to go a bit further on the Campaign of Campaigns. This is an initiative aiming at rallying support around macro topics that are really core at the solutions that we need for the people and the planet. And all of these ideas, we will share the link with you very soon of the Campaign of Campaigns so that you can support us. And all of these ideas have at the center the notion that these are macro and global measures that we need to take, because no country nor regional alone can really tackle all of these challenges. The greatest example is, for instance, climate change, and we're proposing, for instance, to go about a feminist decolonial global Green New Deal. But you will see as well that there are many challenges, such as the ones that are at the core of the conversation today, such as debt, trade, tax justice, and many others that are really impacting the way our countries and our daily lives are coping or not with the current multiple layered crisis. So this is a really real honor for us, because we have an extremely exciting lineup, superstars in their own sense, and we could not be happier to have them here, especially to have a conversation with all of you within the feminist movement. So I'm gonna start giving the floor to a Mexican expert who's working on the intersection of many of these issues. She's Artemisa Montesilvan, and she's the executive director of the Mexican Observatory of the Crisis. And Artemisa is here to lay some ground and to give us an overview of what is happening in the world and why the intersection of these three issues are needed. So, Artemisa, over to you.
Okay, hi everyone. Wherever you are in the world, thank you Rosa and Emilia for the invitation, and congratulations on this great initiative. I think it's really important to put economics on the table when we talk about gender, and gender on the table when we talk about economics. So yes, I have some slides. I don't know if you have them at hand, please. And also great to share this panel with all these wonderful people that I admire their work. So hi, everybody.
Let me see if I can share your slides now. If you can start, because I don't. Let me give me a minute.
Okay. I'll take the opportunity to tell everyone to join the campaign of campaigns. It's a wonderful effort, and it certainly will be bigger if more of us join it, make a big splash.
Sorry, my apologies. I have your slides here.
Okay, thank you. Great. Okay, yeah, so I wanted to take the opportunity that, as Emilia mentioned, we are at the day 360 after the confinement, to say that basically the world now is at a crossroad in the COVID aftermath. So I think it's a kind of, okay. So basically, next one, please. We have two options, and everyone is talking about going back to normal and how vaccination will lead us into this road back into where we used the life we used to have, and everything will be normal again. But the first question I guess we really need to ask is pre-20 world a place we really want to go back to? And in order to put that in perspective, I just want to mention that already in 2019 we were on the brink of an economic crisis, and we usually know now, after many years of studying, what are the warning signs previous to a crisis, to an economic crisis, and all of them were already present before the COVID-19 outbreak. So usually we hear that this crisis, that we are, this economic slowdown or downturn, is product of COVID and the lockdown, but in reality, we already had many of these symptoms in the economy. So let's check this out really quickly. So what are some of the warning signs that we already identified in the brink of a crisis? Well, the first thing is we usually know that when asset prices go high, the economy tends to go low. And what does this mean? That over the years, we know that a sustained increase in the price of economic assets can precede a crisis episode. So what is an economic asset? It's any item that can store value and from which its owner can derive economic benefits by holding them, using them, or selling them over a period of time. So some economic assets that we are familiar with is obviously gold, oil, silver, land, and nowadays Bitcoin. So although the specific sector experiencing a boom can vary across crises, sometimes you heard about the oil crisis in the 70s, or you heard about the housing crisis in 2008, you always be able to witness this rise in asset prices before a crisis. So let's see where were we before the outbreak. So in this slide, the next slide, please. Here we have a graphic with the 20 city US Composite Price Index. This is the main cities in the United States and the price of houses. And as you can see there in the slide, we have, please notice that all the vertical lines on the graph are periods of crisis or recession. So the first star that you have, the first star is 2006. And you can see how the price of houses went really up. And I draw this line for you to see that in 2018, we had already reached the same level of house inflation, we call it, and the inflation in the housing market. And by 2020, we were way past that level of price. On the other chart is we have gold and silver prices. As I'm not sure if you can see it completely, but also we can see the crisis of the 80s. That is known as the debt crisis, and especially was hard in many countries in Latin America, and in Africa. So here we see how the price of gold and silver was really high. And further on the right of the graph, you can see also then in 2008, it was really high again. And obviously by 2019, the prices went up, and now we can see they're still going higher and higher. On the next one, please. So usually, in the way we understand the economy, consumer spending is driven by job growth. So what does that mean? People have more money when the economy is healthy. You create jobs, so people get better salaries, and more people get employed. But for since at least 20 years, we've seen that there's no job creation. So they have been slowing down. And we expect, in fact, that there will be less and less jobs over time. So what is driving consumption now? What is driving this rise in the assets and the price of assets? There are two elements. One is speculation, and the other one is credit. So this tendency clearly points out to the building of a new economic crisis that has been in the making for at least 3 years, since 2018. So immediately after the beginning of the lockdown, there was actually it was something good, because there was a slowdown in these tendencies of the increase in asset prices because of uncertainty. But after there was like this normalization of the lockdown, we saw a new rise in the price of economic and financial assets, and they have been going up since July 2020. And the most worrying thing is that people are talking about this like it's a sign of economic recovery, when it's not really what is going on. So can we see the next slide, please? So here you can see how the net of household and non-profits has been going up. And that's what I was talking to you about, when this usually goes up when there's more jobs, when there's an economic, a dynamic economy. So there's more jobs, better salaries, etc. But here is driven by basically credit. And you could also see at the bottom a graph with the prices of oil and the price of the main stocks in Wall Street. So you can also see how in all those periods before the crisis, remember those vertical lines, they go up, and now you can see that at the end of the graph, that is to 2020, you could also see after the lockdown, when you see a downturn, how they're going up again. And on the right side of the presentation, there is also a graphic for Bitcoin, and this is one you certainly have heard on the news. How this currency is going up and up. And from the point it started, it has had levels of growth that are, I guess, out of the chart. So this is one of the warning signs that we usually detect is a crisis is in the making when you see economic assets raising their prices. The next one, please. Another topic that is really as a sign of a crisis is when we are in the phase of poor regulation. And this poor regulation leads to financial liberalization. And this financial liberalization leads to crisis. Why? Because when you have poor regulation, you usually attract capital account liberalization, attracts large capital inflows. And these inflows increase a pressure on the loosely regulated domestic financial systems, meaning usually money is able to come in and leave without any kind of regulation or mechanism to minimize the impact of the inflows and outflows. So even there was a panel after the 2008 financial crisis, and they made a report, and basically what they concluded was that the widespread failures in the financial regulation and supervision proved devastating to the stability of the nation's financial markets. This is in the US. More than 30 years of deregulation and reliance on self-regulation by financial institutions had stripped away current safeguards, which could have helped avoid a catastrophe. That was the panel that analyzed the 2008 financial crisis. So far, the regulation has not stopped, it has continued, and there were some provisions that were set after the 2008 crisis that we know as Dodd-Frank. And some of those have also been stripped down. So market-based finance, what we know as shadow banking, so this means other instruments beyond the banks, is now growing as an element of financial instability. The next one, please. And in order for you to see how this is going on, here we have a graph on the emerging markets assets total returns. So this is from June 2008 to September 2020. And here you can see how emerging markets have these fluctuations in inflows and outflows. And again, you can see that in March 2020, when the lockdown, you have a deep fall, but now we are even in a higher level than what we had in previous to the lockdown. So this is another warning sign that a crisis could be in the midst. The next one, please. What is the other thing that has led to this crisis, and this something we really need to reconsider when we are going back or moving forward, is poor policy choices. We can see that in many countries, or most countries, there has been a decrease for over the years on health expenditure. So we know that usually when there is an economic downturn, the two sectors that were more affected were health and education. And here we have a graph that can show the green line is population growth. This is a global chart, meaning the tendency worldwide. Then you see the orange bars is GDP, and the tiny squares at the bottom are the investment in the expenditure in health. So even if you have a steady growth in population and you have some growth in GDP, you can see that the tendency to expand in health, investments in health, remain really small. And this is a chart worldwide. Next one, please. And this is an example for Mexico. Here you can see that even it's the same, or even worse because the proportion for health expenditure is even lower. So this talks about the poor policy choices in terms of investing public money. And we can see the next one, please. It's also from Mexico. And this is the chart on how money, the bars are the expenditure. This is in pesos, Mexican pesos. The blue line is the percentage of public expenditure, and you can see how it's going down as well over the years. And the orange dotted line is the proportion of GDP that is spent in health. And it's also, you can see, it has been decreasing. And it's a commentary here that actually what the government is planning to invest on the vaccination campaign is almost the same amount that that of the increase of the budget from 2019 to 2020. Meaning, if you invested over time, if you would have invested over time, your public health system would have been stronger, and maybe lockdowns would have been less dramatic. So this is to think about policy choices. The next one, please. Another component that is really important and we need to start talking about together with economics and gender is environmental degradation. So for many years, we have been warned about how environmental degradation influences the emergency and reemergency of infectious diseases, in addition to multiple human, biological, and ecological determinants. Human susceptibility to infections might be further compounded by malnutrition that is associated with poverty due to climate stress on agriculture and potential alterations in the human immune system caused by the increasing flux of ultraviolet radiation. Also, the loss of biodiversity in the ecosystem has created the general conditions that have favored and in fact made possible the insurgence of the COVID-19 pandemic. Deforestation, changes in forest habitats, poorly regulated agricultural spaces, mismanaged urban growth. And they have also altered the composition of wildlife communities, greatly increased the contacts of humans with wildlife, and altered niches that harbor pathogens, increasing their chances to come in contact with humans. So also something we knew that was coming and we didn't take the provisions to prevent it. So that was option one, the old normal. Do we really want to go back to that? Or what about thinking about moving forward to a new reality? And this might be...
You have 2 minutes.
Okay, yeah, almost there. This might be one in a lifetime opportunity to push forward an economy for people and planet. So the next one, please. We already know the price, the cost of maintaining the status quo. So the IMF estimates that the global COVID-19 pandemic cost at 28 trillion in lost output. This is 4.4% of world GDP. Inequality is growing for more than 70% of the global population, exacerbating the risk of divisions and hampering economic and social development. And during this period, billionaires' wealth rose to 10.2 trillion amid the COVID crisis. So super rich increased fortunes by more than a quarter during the market turmoil. On the other hand, a new economy for people and planet. We know that the recent Green Economy report by UNEP proposes a 1.3 trillion. This is 2% of the world GDP target for green, public plus private investment. So already in terms of money, it's more expensive to stay with what we have than to move forward. And we also know that the total per capita annual cost to achieve the SDGs has been estimated at 414 for less income countries and at 541 for mix. So the choices are clear. The writing is on the wall. We can stay or try to go back to where we were. There's nothing really good waiting for us there, or we can use this opportunity to move forward. So thank you very much. And if there's any questions, I'm here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Artemisa. This was super helpful, especially in thinking that Oxfam ran an estimation of what's the cost of what's the yearly value that women are producing in unpaid domestic and care work, and it amounted to 10.8 trillion. So I found that very interesting in comparison with the figure you gave on 10.2, the rise of wealth of the multi-billionaires, because it shows that it's actually women with their unpaid domestic and care work who are sustaining, and they're being exploited to precisely arise into that counterpoint of what the millionaires are gaining just by exploiting the work of all of the population. And let's not add the figures on women in the informal sectors and those who are underpaid, etc. But I will stick to what you said about how it was actually the economic crisis causing the pandemic and not the other way around. And this is a big message and a red alert that we need to have in mind in thinking about this complexity of the intertwinings of all of these elements. So thank you very much, Artemisa. I'm going to bring our next panelist, and then we're going to go back to a segment of questions and answers in which you will able to bring all your questions to Artemisa and all of the panelists. So please write them down, and then we will go back to our conversation. So our next panelist is Jason Braganza. He's the Executive Director of the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development, after that. And he's here to talk to us about what are the dimensions that debt is having in these intertwining of different elements that are making things very harsh for the people and the planet. That is almost becoming a sexy topic. I mean, everybody hears about how debt is at the core of our concerns, but yet we need to understand better how is debt in the different aspects something that feminists needs to be mindful. So for that, we have Jason here to talk to us about that issue. So over to you, Jason.
Great. Thank you so much, Emilia and Rosa, for the kind opportunity to speak at this session. I only have one slide, but I hope that I'll continue, and I hope everybody can see it now. Just put a thumbs up if you can see it.
We can hear.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, thank you so much. I chose this slide actually because I was just reading through the African Economic Outlook that was published and released a couple of weeks ago. And in the context of Africa, this is one of the findings that came out of the study, and that's in the report, that women and female-headed households could represent a large proportion of the newly poor due to COVID-19. And I think this really resonates very well with what Artemisa concluded with about, do we want to conform to the narrative about building back better, or do we really want to look forward and build forward together? And I think, you know, the importance around the conversation that we're having today around the structural issues and the structural tensions that are contributing and exacerbating the inequalities, the poverty, is an opportune time for us to really reflect thoroughly about how we provide the reforms and at a very deeper level in order to build forward together in a much better way. With regard to the debt crisis that we're currently facing, and I also agree with Artemisa's premise here and yours, Emilia, that, you know, that the COVID-19 has only elucidated what many in our space call the soft underbelly of the neoliberal globalization agenda. And it has brought to the fore the deep inequalities that exist, whether it is at the citizen level or whether it is at the government relation level with the way institutions interact. And so over time, what we've witnessed is the dominance of a neoliberal agenda that is heavily premised around profiteering at the expense of those who are vulnerable, and everyone who does not, or those who are weak when it comes to negotiating and negotiating strong positions. In the context of developing countries, what has ended up happening over the last 15, 20 years following the first wave of debt cancellation in 2005 is that the conditions that came with it was this opening and liberalizing of our economies. And as such, the push and encouragement of private finance to come into the development agenda without necessarily understanding the structures of our economy, without understanding the structures of society, and therefore excluding many segments of society from the benefits that would accrue from capital and from development. Secondly, there has been a focus on economic growth as opposed to economic development. And when you look at that, when you separate the two numbers, when you think of economic development, this is where the focus and the emphasis tends to be on every single citizen, women, children, those with disabilities, who often in the economic growth figures are not included as being contributors or as being important economic agents and contributors to the development of an economy. And so it is quite important then for us to take a step back in the current crisis to understand what needs to change at the structural level to ensure that any solution or any proposals coming out of the current crisis does not lead to any form of regression or going back to the structural inequalities that have existed. Just to drill down a little bit further to understand how the debt crisis is likely to have more deeper structural challenges than just the economic ones. The estimates around poverty and lost opportunities amongst women and girls in particular, is estimated to be quite high. So, for example, in the context of sub-Saharan Africa, there are some estimates that are saying that economies are like the continent is likely to lose an estimated 500 billion US dollars from lost education opportunities. Now, this is a significantly huge figure when you think about the decisions that households have to make when they're then deciding whether to send children to school or not. And given the way society and culture is structured, we're certainly going to see the girl child being the net loser, because the decisions being made at the household level invariably are biased against the girl child. And so when we're talking about this, it's important that in terms of the solutions, in terms of the proposals, that we do not allow any of this type of decision making at the household level to happen. And that is why, in understanding how the debt crisis is unfolding in different parts of the world, it is equally important to understand the economic, social, and cultural settings that also need to be part of the solutions and part of the proposals that are going to make us come out of the situation that we're in a much better, equitable, and fairer way. My last point is also about is about the power dynamics in the current conversation. There's been very little conversation that has emphasized the importance of inclusion of women, of children, of young people, and of those with disabilities. And I think, again, we run the risk of there being a fundamental flaw in any of the proposals or the proposed solutions being put forward. There's a lot of energy and advocacy and lobbying going into looking at economic stimulus packages, economic reform packages, but many of them are actually very narrowly focused at looking at rebuilding and stimulating economies, supporting businesses. Very few of them are actually looking at how to renegotiate and redesign the social contract between the citizen and the state, and the citizen here includes men, women, children, young people, and those with disabilities. So this is an opportunity that the pandemic, the debt crisis is putting forward for us to really challenge the status quo, to really challenge the way we look at the social contract between the citizen and the state, but also in understanding the underlying factor that there is a bigger proportion of the population that must be included in any sort of solution or any sort of proposal if we are going to deal with the structural issues that have actually led to this current crisis that we're facing. So I think these are a few of the points that I wanted to highlight and put forward in part of this forum, and I look forward to having a conversation with the participants and responding to any of the conversations that might come through. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason. Before you go, I wanted to ask you something. How can you explain to us how the response measures to COVID are related to debt? How are those enhancing the difficult situation that our countries in the developing world are already having?
Yes, absolutely. So again, many of the proposals, and I think, Tove will also touch on some of these, there's a trade-off that's being put forward that governments have to face when they're sort of dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. You're having to trade off investing in your social protection amidst declining tax revenue collection, but at the same time, debt servicing needs to take place. These debt repayments have come due. Creditors are not necessarily willing to come to the negotiating table to allow some sort of relief. And this is in particular the private creditors that we're talking about that have hitherto been very silent on providing that physical space for governments, and therefore governments are having to trade off social protection investment and protecting citizens at the expense of paying off debts.
Thank you so much. This is crucial, and also you're making me recall as well that there are different ways to address these issues. On the one hand, the private creditors are not willing to negotiate, and therefore they're risking the lives of people on the ground, because of course governments then are torn between I'm being threatened, I'm gonna be sued by these private actors, or I'm gonna be able to make my public spending to respond to all of these issues that you mentioned, for instance, in education or health. But on the other hand as well, the public debt is a real issue. And I recall our colleagues from the Jubilee Debt Campaign saying that if only the IMF's 7% gold reserve would be spent in alleviating the debt of the most poorer countries, then the IMF would still have enough of the reserves that they gained in the past year, so it will not deplete the IMF. It would actually leave let me see, just by selling less than 7% of the IMF's gold would generate a 12 billion profit, which is enough to cancel the debts owed by the 73 poorest countries until the end of 2021, and still leave the Washington-based organization with 26 billion more gold than it held at the start of the year. So there are many solutions, as Artemisa was saying, and it is just a matter of will. It is just a matter of prioritizing the well-being of people over profit, and to really reorganize the international financial architecture. But speaking to this precisely, I have a stellar speaker to tie up to what our previous panelists are saying. She's our amazing Tove Maria Riding. She's a policy advocacy manager on tax justice at the European Network on Debt and Development, Eurodat. So Tove, tell us about the relation that tax is playing in all of these in all of this huge puzzle of elements that we're trying here to untangle.
Yes, first of all, thank you so much, Rosa and Emilia, for not just for arranging this event, but for always being such amazing engines in these discussions and this fight for justice. It's always a pleasure to work with you, and not least to be here today. Yeah, I think these are hard times. Of course, we've been talking for the last year about how the COVID crisis started as a health crisis and then morphed into so many other crises, including an inequality crisis, all types of inequalities, and not least gender inequalities. Basically means that if you were vulnerable at the onset of the crisis, you're also the first one to be impacted, and you're feeling a stronger impact than, especially then, of course, the wealthiest. But basically, the more discriminated you were to begin with, the more in the front line you will be when the impacts come. And unfortunately, of course, the virus was just phase one of this crisis. Phase two will have enormous social economic impact, and phase two also started already last year. But it's going to continue for a while, and I think what we're seeing right now is something that the economic justice movement has been talking about for a long time, which is that we don't have the global mechanisms to ensure economic justice. Our governments have committed themselves to protecting human rights and ensuring gender equality and achieving the sustainable development goals. But once the economy starts moving and once the different types of crises start unfolding, we often have no protection mechanisms, especially for the world's poorest. And as Jason talked about, of course, the debt situation is a particularly cruel example, because we have all these creditors that come to countries and demand to have the debt serviced. But there's not enough money. That's the core problem. If you look at the national level, there just is not enough money to fight the crisis and fight COVID. But also there's even a lack of money of just protecting basic human rights and social services, let alone all the people that have lost their jobs and are suddenly much more exposed or are feeling the crisis in other ways. And then we have the creditors that want their part of the pie. So what do we do when there's not enough money? And I think this is the discussion that has become so painful to watch now, because of course the creditors have a legal right to get their money. All the poorest in the country, you can say, have a legal right as well, because our governments have signed on to human rights. But that legal right does not have a mechanism to be enforced. And these are the discussions about how we need global economic governance to be fair. We need to have the mechanisms that ensure that human rights will not be pushed aside when creditors come and claim their rights. And so I think this discussion, it's particularly important now that we really talk about how to get these global justice mechanisms. And unfortunately, the discussion on tax is a bit the flip side of the discussion on debt, because tax, of course, is a way to raise money. And if you have a really good tax system, then tax systems can be used to reduce inequalities. It can go in and correct some of the mistakes that appear when our economy turns into the classic, you can say, trickle-up economy, like we're seeing now, that the richest in society are suddenly going much richer during a crisis, and meanwhile we have so many falling into poverty. And a tax system, if you have a really good tax system, it can go in and make sure that we take the largest part of the taxes from those who have the most, and we redistribute it and use it to protect the poorest. So a progressive tax system will proportionately fall more heavily on the richest. Unfortunately, because we also on tax have a bit to go before we achieve tax justice, we're seeing often the opposite. Many governments are stuck in a difficult situation because when they look at how they can collect tax, when they look at the biggest corporations, multinational corporations, some of them are making very large profits during the crisis. It's very, very hard to tax multinational corporations today because profits gets hidden away in what we often call tax havens. And despite years of efforts to try and put in place the mechanisms we need to stop this problem and make sure that countries can really effectively tax multinational corporations, we still don't have the mechanisms needed. If government then look at the wealthiest individuals, unfortunately, we still have a lot of countries that find it very hard to get the information they need to show who has a hidden bank account in a tax haven. We've had some international agreements to promote information exchange, but unfortunately, the situation we have is that European governments have had a lot of progress in their access to information so that they can find their citizens and find hidden bank accounts. The United States has had amazing progress and get much more information about American citizens that have hidden bank accounts. If you look at least developed countries, they receive, it's very hard to find examples of a least developed country that is receiving this type of information. And even for the larger group of developing countries, it's still very hard for them to get the information they need to enforce their tax rules. So even when we have now at the national level an increasing discussion about introducing wealth taxes, which is a very important discussion, there's still a very big question on how do you find the wealth that you want to tax. And this discussion about wealthy individuals and big corporations that aren't paying tax comes back to the same problem, which is that we don't have international tax cooperation. We don't have the international agreements we need to make sure that we stop tax havens and we make it possible for national governments to really effectively tax those that have the most money. So this is this is a problem that means that when the government is then looking at how can they collect tax money to get more resources, they often choose one of two bad solutions. The first bad solution is to collect less tax. If you collect less tax, it means that you have even less money, and that means it's difficult to fund public services. When you fail to fund public services, we know that due to other types of gender discrimination and the way that our societies work at the moment, it impacts women much harder than it impacts men. It's a very strong gender inequality tool when public services are underfunded. It has devastating impacts. The other solution that many governments choose is to tax something else, to find some people that can't hide their money in tax havens and tax them. And most often they start looking at consumers. Whoever goes into a supermarket and buys an item can be taxed through, for example, value-added tax. And this is a mechanism that many governments have started using more and more. And we also know that this type of tax, again, impacts women disproportionately hard, because they are using, relatively speaking, a larger share of their income on consumption goods. So as we had one African partner that highlighted that now, she said, now we have tax on diapers in African countries, but we still don't have big multinational corporations paying tax. So basically, the failure of the global tax system to stop tax havens means that we have regressive impacts at the national level, and thus we have an increase in inequalities within countries. Now, how did we end up in this mess? And this is something you'll see the tax justice movement have a lot of focus on. We asked ourselves not just why the tax rules aren't working, but also who wrote these tax rules that aren't working and why is no one fixing it? And unfortunately, the tax system we have actually dates back almost 100 years. 100 years ago, there barely were things called multinational corporations, and definitely not to the extent we have today. But the tax system is extremely old and has some very old-fashioned ways of thinking about international taxation. And for the last 50 years, the leading organization on setting global tax rules has been the OECD. Of course, the OECD has a much smaller membership than the United Nations. And the OECD then works together with other groups such as the G20. They also set up different types of forums where countries can join and be part of the negotiations. But it's always based on some conditions about signing up to agreements that have already been made. And also there's a lot of nervousness about having an organization like the OECD, which has less than 40 members, be in charge and be the leading organization on setting global tax rules. Because what many developing countries ask is, well, the OECD is commonly known as the rich countries club. And how are their interests going to be represented if the OECD is the leading organization on setting global tax rules? We also see in the tax rules we have that not only are they ineffective, but they're also biased towards the interest of richer countries. So those are serious problems. And that's why we're calling on a global negotiation on tax to take place at the United Nations. At the United Nations, we have all countries represented as equals. But we also have something else that's important. We have the global commitments on everything from gender equality and sustainable development goals to human rights and climate change. We need to link these agendas, because if we have a failure in the global tax system, the other agendas are going to fail as well. So we have long been arguing for having a UN-led global tax negotiations. And recently we saw a high-level panel known as the FACTI panel come out with their final report, and also again emphasized the importance of getting a UN tax convention to make sure that we get the agreements we need to end tax havens, stop illicit financial flows, and get the national tax systems we need. But as part of this, for us, it's also extremely important to have the commitments that governments have also made on making sure that we fund public services, that we have social protection floors, and that we have progressive tax systems, because these are the mechanisms that are so important for fighting inequalities, including gender inequalities. And the UN tax negotiation would also be an important platform to start the discussion about what would a feminist tax system look like. So these are some of the issues that we work on. Similarly, on debt, we're also calling for a UN debt workup mechanism to be the place where we can look at a country's debt situation and say, how can this be solved in a way that doesn't compromise human rights? How can we make sure that a government's commitment to human rights is weighed in the same way as a government's commitment to a creditor? And how can we make sure that we don't have the most vulnerable in a country paying the price because a creditor wants money? And there, we also need to talk about some of the important issues such as debt cancellation. Sometimes it's not going to be possible to make all the creditors happy when it means that someone else is going to have their human rights compromised. So this is again a UN solution that we're calling for, to make sure that the commitments that governments have made to protect all people and their human rights are not suddenly compromised just because we have these economic problems coming up. So thank you again for the invitation. It's always a pleasure
Thank you
to
so much,
discuss.
Tove. And listening to you all, I mean, we've had amazing panelists already speaking, and they're reminding us that we're in the context that is not neutral at all. It is actually a context that is definitely showing the how contemporary, how up to date is colonialism in practice. It's not something from the past. I mean, all of them somehow have alluded to the way in which developed countries are still exploiting our global south. And this is very relevant, for instance, in all of these issues, because we're wondering where is the money going to come to address all of these, the impact of COVID and all of these crises. And we see, for instance, that even, let me tell you, even some northern movements like environmentalists are calling for positive conditionalities in relation to response measures by the institutional financial institutions. So they say, why don't you ask developing countries to commit on reducing fossil fuels consumption, etc., while our countries are in a huge crisis. And so it's again by reproducing colonial practices. And I think for us as social movements, we need to be mindful of the colonial setting that all of our colleagues have already expressed. And I think Sangeeta is going to go well to dive into that. But this is a warning as well that we need to make, because on the other end, many of these responses on conditionalities are also falling on the shoulders of women because of the counter-cyclical measures or the austerity measures that are again cutting the budget of social spending. And then again, it falls back on the shoulders of women. And as Toby was saying, where do we get the money to get back that social spending if everything is going to the corporations? So big questions, big issues. And Sangeeta is going to tell us about the hot potato in the room that is happening now globally, because it is impacting the real access to health, to well-being. Now we know that there is a discussion at the WTO on how governments can have access to vaccines. And then there is this block that is saying, well, we need to respect intellectual property rights. And again, Sangeeta is going to tell us about what is this about corporations having rights as opposed to human rights. And we are facing a big inequality between those who are having access to vaccines and those who haven't. So Sangeeta, tell us all about it. And we just really also want to know what are the next steps in the face of these scenarios. But over to you. We are very thrilled to having you, Sangeeta. Sangeeta Shashikant is the legal advisor of the Third World Network, and we are super thrilled to having you here to share your wisdom with all of us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I think you have gotten me right into the issue. I just want to say as a starting point, I think this topic very much fits into all the issues raised by the different speakers. Although it's about access to medicines, the structural inequity that we are facing is actually the result of really some of these flawed access models that have been there even before in the pre-pandemic period. So what we are really experiencing here with respect to inequitable access, it's not just a COVID-related issue, it's really arising from a flawed access to model approaches even before the pandemic. So I just wanted to mention that and as we went into the pandemic, it was declared in March last year. It seemed as if, if you hear all the early pronouncements that were made by the world leaders, commitment to global public goods. We had President Macron talking about vaccine being a global public good. We had the Chancellor Merkel saying the same thing. We had the President of the European Commission, and we had several other world leaders as well talking about, how in COVID-19 and a pandemic, we all have to come together. We cannot appropriate this knowledge. So all of these pronouncements, claims were made. There was promises to international solidarity, but actually what we have seen is that in practice, nothing much has changed. We have actually huge disparity in access from its very beginning. We are now talking a lot about vaccines, but even from the very beginning, there have been huge disparities in access between the developed countries and the developing countries and the least developed countries as well. And this was captured very much by a UNCTAD report in 2020, which actually said that the low-income countries and middle-income countries are actually being priced out of access. So firstly, we create artificial supply constraints, and then we price the low-income and middle-income countries out of access. And this is actually what has been happening. And I just wanted to show, so if you look at, we want to control a pandemic, one of the basic things you need to have is really diagnostic kits, sufficient diagnostic kits at very affordable prices. But because there is a monopoly around these diagnostic kits, we see that a lot of the developed countries are actually being able to do more testing than in developing countries and least developed countries. So you see in the least developed countries, the level of testing per million is quite low. So it's very difficult. Without testing, you do not know what variants are circulating. And if you do not know what variants are circulating, you cannot actually develop more effective vaccines. You're always behind, whatever vaccines are being developed. So I think this is an important area that we need to address. So this table shows you the disparity in terms of access to vaccines, where 16% of the world population, the high-income countries, have already confirmed doses of 4.6 billion as compared to other developing and low-income countries. So if you want affordable, equitable access, we need availability and affordability, right? We heard just speakers talking about how at the national level, countries are already struggling, right? With just very basic needs, and now came the crisis, they're going to struggle even more. So affordability is a very big aspect of equitable access. And for availability and affordability, we really need scale up of global manufacturing. We need to diversify suppliers. Currently, suppliers are limited. And as a result, we find that supply is artificially being constrained. So the current access model is really dependent on manufacturers doing voluntary licensing. So they license to selective manufacturers for a certain amount of production. And so they're not engaging all the possible manufacturers globally. So if you take the example of remdesivir, last year, I think mid last year, it was considered that remdesivir, where Gilead is the patent holder, was considered to be somewhat effective in improving the recovery of COVID-19 for COVID-19 patients. Since then, WHO has come up with a different assessment of remdesivir. But at that time, Gilead licensed to a few select manufacturers of its own choosing. And under that license agreement, it's secret. We do not know the terms of that license agreement. The bulk of Gilead's production was actually snapped up by the US and then by the EU. And more than half of the world population was actually excluded from supply under these voluntary licenses. And it was only countries where IP was not an issue, because they're an LDC, they did not have to put in place certain IP frameworks, they were able to manufacture and supply. So I think the current model that we have, it's going to be very inadequate and to achieve equitable access. So this is where IP comes in. If you look at all the medical products, be it test kits, masks, medicines, vaccines, ventilators, or different kinds of technologies, you will have different categories of IP that will be involved, from patents, industrial designs, copyright, and trade secrets. And for instance, we take N95 mask, hundreds of patents, reportedly hundreds of patents around N95 masks. In the US, actually, the governor of Kentucky called on 3M to release its patents. This was last year, to release its patents so others can manufacture. And of course, 3M has not done that. So these are the challenges we face in vaccine, from the development stage, composition, process, manufacturing, even in terms of mechanisms for delivery, it could all be subject to patents. The latest technology, mRNA, is considered to have many patents around it. And these are what we know. The IP landscape is quite uncertain, because there could be patents that we are going to be seeing in the future. Some of them are in the process of being filed. Some of them have been filed but not granted. So the IP landscape itself, it can be quite uncertain. For medicines, there are a few therapeutics under investigation, such as one that is showing a lot of promise is molnupiravir. A Merck product also has patents in quite a few jurisdictions. Tocilizumab also has got patents in a number of jurisdictions. So even therapeutics, quite a few are being investigated. Some of these are even repurpose of old drugs, but then there could be patent applications filed on it in the, we already hear of patent applications actually being filed on it. So this is where the TRIPS waiver comes in. So it was presented by India and South Africa at the WTO. And the idea is to really waive some provisions of the TRIPS agreement, patents, industrial designs, copyright, and provisions in relation to trade secrets in view of global needs. It is today co-sponsored by about 57 countries, and it's supported by the majority of the WTO membership, but it's opposed by the developed countries and countries like Chile and Brazil, and they're opposing any kind of tax-based negotiations. Their thinking is we should not even question these monopolies at this stage, although clearly the manufacturers are sitting on this knowledge, and were these monopolies lifted, it could actually boost manufacturing capacity globally. There is a very solid legal basis for it in Article 9 of the WTO agreement. So it's not something that has just been put forward without any legal basis. There's a legal basis for it. The WTO agreement has a provision that says in exceptional circumstances, obligations can be waived, and this is definitely one such circumstance. And it has been done before, waivers of specific provisions of intellectual property. And it's limited to COVID-19. So that some arguments we hear is that, oh, this is going to be a huge issue for innovation generally, it's going to have a huge impact. No, it's very limited to COVID-19. And of course, it's time limited. Because it's a waiver, it will have to be time limited. So what will this waiver achieve? So at the national level, intellectual property obligations have to be put in place as a result of international obligations, the WTO obligations, which has a dispute settlement mechanism. So the waiver is really to obtain a recognition at the WTO level that countries have the freedom to operate by suspending implementation and enforcement of intellectual property. So at the international level, it will be adopted. And so countries can then use that as an additional tool that they have to address the supply issues. It can also address the procedural and administrative delays in relation to intellectual property. So normally intellectual property laws would have certain legal options to override the intellectual property barriers, but that depends on what is in your national law. And depends, if you've got 4 different categories of intellectual property, depends on what is in each of these laws, what kind of options that you have. And we find that a lot of times national laws do not have sufficient options, or they could have a lot of other procedural and administrative issues related to it. So the waiver is really, if implemented, to say, okay, for COVID medical products, all of these issues are not going to matter. And this can also facilitate collaboration, right? International collaboration, South-South collaboration, sharing of technology, lifting of trade secret protection by governments. So it's about enabling collaboration because here we are facing a global problem. It's not a individual country problem, right? It's a global problem. And so we need a global solution. It facilitates economies of scale because if a country has some capacity in manufacturing some part, but then because it does not have the economies of scale, it may not be a viable option for that country. So by removing this barrier, if you can produce for yourself, as you might have less incentive as opposed to if you can produce for a few countries in the region. And of course, supports countries with insufficient manufacturing capacity because there are countries with more manufacturing capacity than others. So some of the arguments that are put forward by countries opposing the waiver, one common argument you will hear is, oh, WHO has a COVAX facility. We have given a lot, billions of dollars to COVAX. But the reality is that you can give, COVAX is still short of funds, significantly short of most of its funds actually. But money is irrelevant if you do not have the vaccines to supply. And COVAX itself is only looking at 2 billion doses in 2021. This comes nowhere close to what is going to be needed to meet the needs of 6.4 billion people in the low and middle income countries, and what is needed to actually bring the pandemic under control. I'm sure you're already hearing, some of the countries in Europe are already moving towards third wave. So to the extent we have large parts of the world vulnerable, unvaccinated, this variance will come, it will be circulating, and countries are going to face waves and waves of lockdowns, with huge economic and social impacts. The other argument you will hear is, don't worry, there is a lot of BLs happening, a lot of partnerships are taking place. But the reality is these are limited, they are very selective. A lot of the bigger multinational manufacturers have not engaged in that kind of voluntary licensing that is needed to boost production, because they want to maintain monopoly over the technology, especially this mRNA technology, which is the new technology. They are unwilling to share that technology. It's secretive, it's restrictive, and it's voluntary. That means to say you can do it or you do not have to do any licensing. So if you look at 2020, the projected vaccine production was 837 million doses. What was actually produced was only 31 million doses. And in 2021, the demand is 11.5 billion. As of, I think, beginning of March, it was about 400 over million doses. So if this is the model we are going to use, we don't think this is going to be a model that can deliver, because it's really depending on companies that are voluntary. In a global crisis, in a pandemic crisis, it seems the main beneficiary of this are really those holding the intellectual property rights over these medical products, while a lot of other livelihoods, people, industries are actually struggling. Another argument is that IP is important for innovation, the argument is that, oh, if you touch, if you do anything to this IP system, then the whole thing is going to crumble. I think this is a bit of an exaggeration, but beyond that, for COVID-19, most of the R&D has been as a result of public investment. I mean, I can share a lot of this data, and you can see billions of dollars are being spent in procuring these vaccines. These are not cheap vaccines, these are very expensive vaccines. And billions of dollars are being spent in procurement of these vaccines. I think Moderna, I remember one news report, it's made 10 to 15 billion as a result of the vaccine it is supplying. And we are currently in a health emergency. So we have to take that into account. TRIPS flexibilities. So the WTO agreement on intellectual property has got legal options, is known as TRIPS flexibilities. There are limitations. So often one argument is that, oh, but there are sufficient flexibilities. Just discussing this will take quite a bit of time, but just to say that there are limitations. One flexibility that is often talked about is compulsory license. It is used to address patent barriers, but it is normally used on a case-by-case basis. That means to say, if I have a patent, if I see I want access to this product, say remdesivir, I see patent is an issue, I issue a compulsory license to manufacture or import the generic. But what we are facing here is a global problem where the supply chains are also global. And so just relying on compulsory licensing will not be enough. Also, the fact that compulsory licensing does not necessarily apply to all other intellectual property where may be an issue. And so, in that context, it is insufficient. There is also a mechanism known as Article 31 bis. This is to remove some of the conditionalities attached to using compulsory license so that countries can export to other countries with insufficient manufacturing capacity. But this mechanism, a lot of procedures are attached to it. And to date, it has only been used once since its adoption in 2003. And that experience was particularly difficult experience. And MSF that was involved in that experience said it's an unworkable mechanism. And if you look at historically, where countries have used improve their laws, expedite the issuance of compulsory license, they have always been penalized and sanctioned by the EU and the US. Especially the US and the big pharmaceutical industries have always penalized. Even in this COVID-19, where Hungary, Russia, Indonesia have taken steps along the lines to use compulsory license, they have been, the big pharma industry are complaining about it to the US government. So, and asking the US government to invoke Section 301 and put in place sanctions. So I think these are the issues around the TRIPS flexibilities that we need to be aware of. To just say that a lot of these issues have been raised and they have been responded to by the proponents, I've just given some links. And my last slide is to say that even the WHO DG is saying, look, we are in an exceptional circumstance. We need to be on a war footing. And if this is the moment we don't use the flexibilities that we have, then, when would we ever use it? And then I've given the link to our webpage where it has quite a bit of material that could be useful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sangeeta. So many things to say about this, and I mean, we're about to open the floor for questions. For all of the audience out there and in YouTube, please share your questions in the chat, and also here, those who are here in the CSW forum, please share your questions in the chat. And but I'm just thinking, I think we have all a very pressing question. What is next, Sangeeta, after the deadline they had on March 11th? And now, what are the next steps that we can foresee on this conversation?
Yeah, the issue is going to be continued to be discussed in the WTO. There will be other meetings in April. I think for CS organizations that are interested in working on this issue, we have to just use all the different channels available, be a bit creative to really do advocacy with countries that are opposing, and especially the EU and the US. There is already existing advocacy activities that are happening at the national level, but I think it will be useful to bring new perspectives to the table. And to lobby, I think at this level, I don't know whether you heard yesterday, even the president of the European Commission saying all options on the table when she was asked, whether they would be using, whether they will be supporting the TRIPS waiver. So I think this is the opportunity. Countries are really in pain in terms of not being able to control the pandemic. And, I think we have to raise that as an issue to say the current model of just depending on the willingness of companies, it's not sufficient. Governments have to step in to take the relevant steps to force these companies to share that know-how and to lift intellectual property monopolies. So the fact that these governments are so disconnected and supporting just to benefit a few companies, it's kind of outrageous, I would say.
Thank you so much, Sangeeta. And I think we've had a very good overall overview on what are the challenges. On the one hand, Artemisa just amazingly stated how this is all due to the economic system. It's not about some random virus that suddenly appeared on the face of the earth and just came to slash our economies. It is about the way economies work by themselves. And then Jason brought up how the situation is really undermining human rights at all levels on the population that is being most impacted. Toby reminded us that the question about where is the money, where are we going to get the money to afford our responses, our measures in addressing all of these issues, but with a qualitative manner, with human rights, with respect to the environment, with gender equality. And then Sangeeta here is posing us the tension that we have as well globally as to just if there is a virus, if we just limit this to a sanitary challenge and we have vaccines, then how are we going to make them available for everybody? And this TRIPS situation is causing even some experts calling this a genocide situation, because it's really putting at stake the lives of millions of people in the global south. So I'm gonna open the floor since we have a comment on that, but I would like to go back to our panelists for their reflections on what has been discussed. And then when we go to Jason, we can talk a bit about special drawing rights. And we also have a question for Tobe and Jason. But I would like to go to Artemisa first to see what are your points of dialogue with what has been an amazing panel so far on and articulating what your point on the economic system. Go ahead, Artemisa, for 2 or 3 minutes.
Okay, wow, I'm really impressed. I've learned so much this morning. And some of the reflections, first of all, I think it's really, I don't want to use the word sad, but I don't think there's another word. The issue of vaccines and people's lives and availability to this solution, there is a short-term solution, still is one of the solutions, is a business matter. There has to be dealt at the WTO. So I think that says a lot about the world we have built in the past at least 50 years. And I think that's something we really need to reflect on. And that brings me to what Jason said about we really need to start thinking about drafting a new social contract in terms of putting life and human rights and equality at the center of our dealings as humanity. I think we have been seeing for many years how companies disappear, how small companies, how medium-sized companies, how big companies disappear, and they turn into monopolies. And that brings us to all the issues on what I was talking about, assets and inequality and billionaires. And it connects us also to Toby's presentation on taxes. Because when you have these massive entities, governments have no leverage. And that's the real issue. Governments have lost the leverage in front of giants. And if governments are to represent their citizens, that means citizens have lost the leverage in front of these other entities. And I think that's quite worrying. And so I usually have an optimist view on things, despite working on crisis. But now thinking about this, I think there's something that we really need to focus on and to start thinking. And I think this is the best setting, and also this campaign of campaigns, because it's actually saying what we are finding out here this morning is all these issues are connected. And we cannot continue. And of course, environmental degradation is a product of this, because companies have only one thing in mind, and that's the bottom line and the profit. And they're not going to change that unless we organize and put that on the center of this new social contract. So I'm taking that with me. And also, I think it's the time for us to, in terms of women, there's also a big issue when we talk about economic assets, because most women around the world have no access to economic assets. So many countries, even they cannot have land, they cannot inherit. So that means that eventually, even if there was some sort of movement in terms of having access to jobs and these things, the access to assets would be is putting women behind, because as the price of assets goes up, they will never be able to have enough money to have an asset. So that's a perpetuation of gender inequality as well. And we need to start talking about women and property and assets and the ability and the capacity of women to also be part of the economic system, at least to the way of owning something. And then that also bring in some economic protection. So you blew my mind this morning, and I I'm really looking forward to fighting the good fight.
Thank you so much, Artemisa. And you reminded us as well what Tobe already mentioned. But in the face of these giants, what we have is global solidarity and the global movements. That is the only force that can really stand up to these giants that are holding our governments accountable. So this is super important that it's at the core of the campaign. So thank you so much also for rallying the support of all of our audience here in joining the campaign of campaigns. Let's go to Jason. Jason, if you see in the chat, you have an issue on special drawing rights, that there is a new allocation for other countries to receive some loans, grants, whatever. So that seems like a positive issue. And then how our priorities can be highlighted when this new money is circulating. But another question is about what can donor countries like the UK or US need to do to, they say, to make debt conditions fairer for southern countries. I don't think there is anything fair in conditionalities. It's like saying positive discrimination. But let's hear from our experts. And Jason, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think let me start with the second question. And absolutely, I don't think there's anything about fair conditions, so or fair conditionalities between a debtor and a creditor. I think the idea, if we are going to do anything, there should be equality and equity in how things are being negotiated, and that means full disclosure, full transparency, both what Artemisa, Tove, and Sangita have spoken to. Specifically on the special drawing rights issues, I think it's important that we situate this issue on special drawing rights, which is the IMF currency, in a very particular way, in that it is one of several financing options available to deal with the immediate liquidity crisis that's facing developing countries. It is not a solution, it is not a silver bullet, because at the same time, it does not address the structural issues with regard to debtor-creditor relations. It also does not address the structural issues between which the debt architecture, the financial architecture, the tax architecture that Tovi and Sangita have referred to. It's just one of an immediate liquidity provision that allows developing countries to try and support the economy, support citizens, and stimulate some sort of resurgence in the economy. So in terms of what is being negotiated, the G20 together with the African Union finance ministers as well, and a lot of other leaders have given the IMF a mandate to try and work out a mechanism that, or an amount to be allocated through the special drawing rights. An additional thing here that we need to also consider is the allocation mechanism that's going to distribute the special drawing rights. The current system of allocation goes by voter rights, which will invariably benefit the wealthier countries. So in addition to the amount that's being discussed, there also needs to be a mechanism that gives more emphasis on developing countries and those that are most vulnerable. The broader picture around how SDRs are then utilized, I think, speaks to what Artemisa has said. It's all about capital and access to capital. And by this, we don't mean financial capital. There's the human capital aspect, which I tried to speak about when I put up my slide. The effect of closing schools, the effect of disrupted informal economies. These all have the impact of disrupting access to capital and the gain of capital by women in the economy, and this will slow down invariably the recovery when we're trying to build forward together out of this global pandemic. So when we're talking about the SDRs and its utilization and its efficacy, it should be seen in this broader context as we talk about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jason. This is super enlightening. And I just want to say that we're on time. I think the CSO NGO Forum will allow us to go a bit up until 10 minutes longer. So, but they're going to cut the transmission. So let's make sure that we hear the wrap up of Tove. And then I'll go to Sangita. But this can be another conversation further, and we will make sure that the Campaign of Campaigns organizes it. Tove, over to you.
A very quick answer to the question about what donor countries can do. I'm not sure we should use that term, but what the Europeans and the Americans need to do is to get out of all these little clubs where they sit and make decisions that have global impacts and start cooperating for real. We have the G20, we have the Paris Club that makes decisions on debt, and we have the OECD on tax. Those are not bodies to sit and make global decisions. So come to the table and find global solutions, both to unsustainable debt situations, but also to define what responsible borrowing and lending is. So start working together with developing countries to solve these global problems.
Thank you so much, Tove. And there is a comment on the FACTI panel, if you want to address it before we go to Sangeeta. They're saying that a UN tax structure as advanced by the FACTI panel is ideal. However, how do countries address processes such as the challenge of double taxation agreements, which may be outside the ambit of a global body?
Right now, double tax treaties are actually part of the things that are being discussed in the OECD and other bodies. But generally, we need to get from a situation where the tax system globally is regulated by thousands of bilateral treaties. So this is part of the chaos that is our tax system. And these tax treaties, even the IMF has warned developing countries from signing on to them. So this is a part of the problem. We need a global structure that's going to make all these thousands of bilateral treaties redundant. But until we have that, all countries, developing countries, but also some developed countries, need to be very careful with signing on to legally binding agreements on corporate taxation. We've seen these agreements backfire very, very strongly many times.
Wow, we're definitely curious to learn about those cases. But thank you so much, Tove. I'm gonna make sure that the Campaign of Campaigns is organizing another conversation after chapter 2, episode 2 of this exciting conversation. Sangeeta, you have a comment here saying that in the chat, some governments have invoked provisions in their national legislation to ramp up production of critical products for the COVID response. And there's a suggestion that this argument should be taken to the multilateral level and through the TRIPS waiver. But I don't know also what else you want to add to close your intervention.
Yeah, so governments have taken compulsory license to manufacture remdesivir. That was what Russia has done recently. Israel did it with a HIV product, which was considered to be useful for the treatment of COVID-19 early in the pandemic. These are options, legal options that countries have available right now at their disposal under the WTO agreement, and they should use it to the maximum. The call for the TRIPS waiver is as an additional flexibility, because I think what we are facing is a global challenge. We need to vaccinate the world population, and then we probably need another round of vaccination as variants emerge, new effective vaccines emerge. So the level of challenge before us is really unprecedented. But the approach of access is the same flawed model pre-pandemic. It's voluntary license. These are not even transparent. We do not even know what is in these voluntary licenses. We do not know who has been given these licenses. We know some of it to the extent is reported in the media, but by and large, there isn't much transparency around it. And I think the developed country governments are, and sometimes even the international organizations are supporting these non-transparent models as the way out of the pandemic. So sure, voluntary licenses can continue, but it's not going to be sufficient, and it's not going to get us out in the pandemic. And if our aim is to ensure we control the pandemic in the shortest time frame, there needs to be more global collaboration. There needs to be a lifting of this monopoly. Actually, what we're seeing is an abuse of the monopoly position. Some of these companies have, because they have a monopoly on the supply, for instance, Pfizer, it was reported they are making a demands of governments to put up their sovereign assets as indemnity as a guarantee against some of the liabilities they would face. So this is an abuse of monopoly position that we are seeing. And if these are the approaches that's going to be taken, then we are quite far away from actually controlling this pandemic. So I think what we really need civil society organizations to do is to raise this issue at a very highest level and to make this a top priority of the government, that the government has to take action, right? They cannot just depend on the company to do the right thing. We know that that's a flawed model. We need the governments to step in, because there is a global crisis that the developed countries themselves are also facing. So it is a position that is also self-defeating, a position that they have taken at the international level. So I think for civil society organizations, to try all channels possible, put out op-eds, letters, petitions. There is already groups working on this, to link up with these groups and to at least reach out to those countries that are opposing, especially the EU and the US.
Thank you so much, Sangeeta. And I'm just going to say that we will be posting on the website of the Campaign of Campaigns all of the amazing work all of you are doing to support you in your campaigns, in your efforts. So stay tuned in the audience for that. I just want to close with apologizing for the technical issues, background noises, whatever. But, I want to tell you, this is what resistance looks like in the middle of a pandemic. So really, yay to all of you and all of us who are doing this work, engaging with global discussions in the middle of a huge crisis. And I also wanted to say that the challenge of vaccines is also posing to all of us who wants to engage in the global community is that there are going to be negotiations and we cannot attend, and those who will be present in majoritarily will be developed countries, the richer countries, again trying to impose. So this is a conversation we still need to have going on with the resistance, but at the same time in allowing the well-being of everybody, self-care, but still managing to find inventive and creative ways, etc. That's another conversation for the Campaign of Campaigns. But thank you, all of you, for being with us, the audience, our amazing stardom of panelists. I'm just overstruck with awe in hearing all of you. We want to also thank the technical team who's been helping us, and the CSO and the NGO CSW Forum that is hosting us in an amazing space. And just let you know, the video will be uploaded in the Women's Working Group YouTube, and then we will upload it into the Campaign of Campaigns. And I'm just gonna be welcoming Rosa to say goodbye before we are cut down from this.
Emilia, you said it all, but I really want to thank the speakers, Sangeeta, Tove, Jason. What you've done is taken these financing for development discussion topics and Artemisa, and you've really put a gender analysis to it. And so that's really very, very appreciative, because I just saw in the chat that this is one of the best sessions at the NGO CSW, and I agree, because as you all have said, we need to integrate these issues and raise them at the highest level. So thank you for bringing these messages, and thank you for educating us. And thank you so much. And we're so happy that you're in the fight with us in this. So thank you so much. Stay well, keep healthy, and keep mobilizing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. A pleasure. Take care.